first case, just prior to knocking on their door, the evangelist said to me, this was in a district in Alaska, he was a visiting evangelist. He said, don't be surprised, Mark, if we get thrown out of this house. I'm going to put him in a corner because I think he's lying when he says he doesn't believe in heaven. Sure enough, not long into the conversation, the evangelist challenged the husband of one of my most involved church members. Her husband, who joined the church in order to marry his sweetheart, occasionally attended church and came to each of the potlucks. The evangelist said to him, Jim, you may have to throw us out of your home tonight, because I'm just going to come right out and say, you are lying to me when you say you don't believe in heaven. Well, of course, Jim bristled, and a few minutes later, he did ask us to leave. It wasn't long after, maybe that same night, when the evangelist proclaimed to the audience that he had been thrown out of a home recently because of his courageous effort to stand up for God and the gospel. I'm going to refer later to a thing called nudge theory. If you haven't read about nudge theory, it's worth reading. Case number 2. The 9th quarter of my seminary education involved being assigned to a local church with a successful church growth pastor evangelist. He was supposed to teach 8 of us, fresh seminary graduates, how to be successful pastor evangelists. Among other things, a couple of his strategies rubbed several of us the wrong way. I've listed a few. If the people we had been assigned to visit were not responding to our directive conversation, our nudge conversations, then we were to drop them and move on to the next interest. We were made to read one of his
like Jim
books, and I put that in quotes, about how to persuade people without manipulating people. Here's where I mentioned nudge theory. Another one that we found difficult was if we couldn't persuade someone to continue to attend the meetings and make tangible progress toward baptism, like removing their jewelry, the pastor evangelist would take over and lead the way. In one case, he worked with a woman who, when baptized, gave a testimony about removing and selling her jewelry. In the lobby of the church afterwards, she stood to greet everyone in one of the finest fur coats I'd ever seen. Now, mind you, I'm Alaskan. I have no qualms about fur coats, despite I know it's an issue. What I was struck by was the sense of what did she understand about stewardship? Apparently, it was simply the jewelry that what got through to her. Anyway, number 4, music volume was part of the evangelist's strategy. We were complaining that it was too loud, but he told us he wanted it that way so it would hurt the audience so as to keep their attention. We began our meetings in a public location with no indication whatsoever about Adventism on any of the brochures or flyers or anything. And we were coached what to say if someone asked us what church was sponsoring the meetings. I've repressed what we were supposed to say. Maybe Lauren or Chris, you may remember what we say. Similarly, if someone asked a specific question about what we believed in this or that doctrine, we were again coached to say, let's wait on that topic until Pastor Z, because he'll address that in a future session. So I'm sure each of you could share different stories as well. Let me proceed then to highlight what we may talk about. So do you have questions and or qualms about the practice of Adventist pastoral evangelism? And we could separate them out, simply evangelism, simply pastoral work, but it's an introductory conversation, so I wanted to be as broad and open to the field as possible. If you don't have any questions or qualms, please don't be surprised if someone else does. And if you do, with what ethical standard could pastoral evangelism be evaluated, scrutinized, and perhaps deemed unethical? Do the ethics of secular professions and institutions have any relevance or bearing on the issue? For instance, I mentioned before we started that I had visited my routine Sabbath school class at Calamasa, where we were talking about just war theory for obvious reasons. And I was giving a brief introduction to over 2,000 years of just war theory. And someone said, well, none of that has any meaning whatsoever because it's all philosophers opining about whatever. What is important is what the Bible teaches about just war theory. Okay, good point. But is it the only thing we can bring to the question? Is there anything from notions of ethics and morality from non-biblical sources? Is there such a thing even in Western society as a non-biblical, entirely secular notion? If you haven't read Tom Holland's book about the influence of Christianity in the West, he highlights the fact that even the word secular is something religion created to identify the non-religious voices around them. Finally, does the fact that God has called us to spread the word override all other concerns? Okay, maybe there's a secular professional code of ethics. It really has no meaning to us because God has made it clear that he wants us to spread his truth. Okay, so here's some of my framing presumptions as an ethicist. Ethics and ethical theory are different than morals and morality. For instance, if I say to Lauren, you are an immoral so-and-so, does that hurt more or less, Lauren, than if I said, Lauren, you're an unethical such and such?
Good
Now, I've been
question.
asking students this question for about 30 years. Almost every single time, people are more deeply offended when I offend their personal morality as opposed to their ethics. The two are not synonymous. They're very close, but they're not synonymous. Morality tends to be more personal. It's framed and formed by forces around us, but it lands in us. We take positions. Things particularly bother us because of our personal sense of ethics and morality. When I go into a profession, law, medicine, business, politics, what are the codes of ethics for the profession? And how do my personal convictions translate into that? For instance, I told you I remain a licensed Seventh-day Adventist minister, but I'm working for a Catholic healthcare organization. We have different perspectives. How do I engage that? All right, descriptive ethics is a part of the ethics work where we talk about what's going on. We have to get clear before we can frame some sort of ought language. We have to understand what's going on. What is going on? So the language changes. Normative ethics says, all right, we understand what's going on. How should we proceed? Should, ought, so on and so forth. This is the language shift. And then finally, once you say, for instance, as I'm going to say earlier, we ought not ever manipulate a family member to reject their family in order to accept church teaching. Ought we ever to do that? My answer is no. Now, once I say that, justification demands that you have a right to challenge me on my position, that we ought not do that. And I have to have good reasons for that position. That's what justification is. It's very simple, and I could go on and on about illustrating. I think you get the point. Now, again, a little bit more about ethics in general. This is how we get along with each other. That's the broadest, most widespread, simple definition I can offer. There are horizontal elements and vertical elements. Horizontally, when we decide to live together, how do we organize our societies to do that successfully? Can there be an ethic, some measure of how to get along, if there is no direction from a divine entity? Linger with that for a minute, because this is a long-standing difficulty for many Christian ethicists. Because we like to think that aside from a Christian ethic, how could anyone have an ethic? Particularly if you're an atheist. How could atheists have any kind of ethical code or even morality? Well, that's a very sadly narrow view. In fact, I would oftentimes enjoy a conversation with an atheist who is oriented to how to treat others well. Going back to the definition, when we decide to live together, even with atheists, how do we organize ourselves? I'd often rather have a conversation with an atheist than I would, someone of a different theological persuasion or religious persuasion that wants to kill me. And then there's the vertical element. If some of us believe there's a divine entity to which we are obliged, what effect does that have on the rules about how we get together, how we live well together? For instance, if our God says, kill all pagans, are we then going to live out our obligation to God and kill non-believing neighbors? And this is not an obtuse or silly question. This happens routinely around the world. Because, in fact, one time at a Sabbath school class, not too many years ago, I posed this question to about 6 or 7 people in the class. If God told you to go kill someone, would you do it? And he shot his hand up immediately. Oh, of course I would. And just like that, I said, well, why, hold on. No, you can't just go kill a neighbor because you think God told you to. Oh, yeah. Oh, there was no lack of assurance on his part. He would do it. Some ethical theories. I've been accused of being a theory wonk. I really love theory, and for years pestered Loma Linda students. I was 16 years a professor at Loma Linda, and I would make them learn about the theories, and oftentimes they would throw their hands up in frustration and say, Dr. Carr, could you just tell us how do we apply this stuff? How would it be applied in my clinical context? And I try to be polite, but I always said, that's for you to figure out. I'm not a clinician. You're the ones in your profession. Here's the framing material. Now go apply it yourselves. I never made too many friends with that answer, but that was, I must admit, a little bit fun for me to do that. And mind you, the theories on this slide, it's not exhaustive, of course, but I think each of us can easily enough find ourselves somewhere in these thoughts. And as I now begin to unpack the particular issues in pastoral ministry and evangelism ministry, maybe consider how these ideas will apply to those contexts. So a duty-based theory would be a deontological ethics. Immanuel Kant, of course, was the most famous adherent, advocate for this approach. In Christianity and other religions, the divine command theory says, if we know God commands this, then our moral duty, what's all this thinking about? What's all this nuance about? If he said, don't do this or do that, then what's all this attention to it? Just go do it or don't do it. So it's actually quite a comforting sort of perspective, because it tends to be more rule oriented. And I would opine that Adventism probably leans in the direction of a duty-based ethic more than others. The consequence-based theories involve looking at the ends. Utilitarianism looks at the consequences of your action. So you have an agent, an action, and the outcome, the intention as well. An agent, the intention of that agent, and the outcome or the consequence. Character-based theories tend to focus on the character of the persons. Classically, virtue ethics is the term. Oftentimes these days we talk about values, but the tradition is really focused on virtues. This is my favorite, combined with the next one, relationship-based ethics. The most recent iteration of it can be referred to as care ethics. You can Google that and find a ton of material about that. And I think I've asked you this before on other occasions when we've visited, to compare and contrast how you might engage one of your life's closest friends if they've asked you to accompany them and comfort them in the process of doing something that you would disagree with. How would you value the relationship and maintaining that relationship when your friend is engaging in something that you would disagree with? Then, of course, rights-based ethics, United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. More and more human rights are, well, it used to be more and more, I'm not sure anymore if it is, but it comes from a theological background of natural rights, which theologians in Europe established long before there were notions of universal human rights. All right, so that's some of the framing stuff. I wanted to mention the fact that there are codes of ethics in professions. The American Medical Association, arguably, and it does assert this, is one of the oldest standing professional societies on the face of the earth, and they have always had some measure of a code of ethics. The Hippocratic Oath, for instance, is what they would refer to. The American Bar Association, of course, despite all of the silly jokes about lawyers not having any ethical, moral values or ethics standards. Better Business Bureau. Everyone has a code of ethics anymore. I get these ads on my LinkedIn account for some companies hiring ethicists, and it's like the company that builds John Deere and Cat, what the big bulldozer, they're advertising for an ethicist, and I'm thinking, what on earth? Well, turns out compliance and ethics get lumped together all the time. Compliance is not ethics. Ethics is not compliance. Law is not ethics, and ethics is not law. There are complex relationships between both. The question we'll address here, tried to highlight down here, code of ethics for pastors. Do we have one in Seventh-day Adventism? Maybe some of you will be able to opine about that. Here's a question for you. How many, shucks, I can't see it because that stupid toolbar is on top there, but I know the question. How many of our Adventist higher educational institutions have an ethics degree program? Does anyone know? Well, it's just, I'm going to just stop sharing for just a moment here, Lauren, just to hear how many ethics degree programs in any of our Seventh-day Adventist higher educations institutions. Anyone?
Well, people can't speak because we
sorry. Okay.
keep them from doing that, but people can write some notes in the.
Yeah, maybe just pop it in the chat thread. Lauren, do you have an answer?
I thought it would only be Loma Linda University. Am I wrong?
I think you're right, but again, that is a graduate level degree particular to bioethics.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, it kind of begs the question, how in the world can we have so many colleges and universities around the world that, and there's no ethics program anywhere. Very quick story as I share my screen again. When I was finishing up at UVA, I was desperate to find work, as you might imagine, right? I've got a lot of debt now I need to deal with, and I was asking deans of schools of religion across the country for work. And I was talking with one at Andrews. I've forgotten his name, but he was the chair of the undergrad theology program, not the seminary. And I was saying, I really would appreciate if you'd consider a job for me as an ethicist. And we were talking, and he was he looked a little puzzled, and he said, "Well, what would you teach?" And I said, "Well, I could teach ethics of the Bible, for instance. I could teach ethics of war. I could teach ethics of human societies." No, he said, and he screwed his face up. He was clearly, no, would you be in the Old Testament or the New Testament? Because those were the only boxes that he appeared to be able to operate from. And mind you, those are not irrelevant categories, but they can't be the only category, can they? Well, on we go. All right, so it is important for me to mention the fact that Lauren and I talked about the possibility of hosting this session some months ago, and I dug into this book. Margaret Batten is actually also a healthcare ethicist, and is renowned and very highly respected in the healthcare ethics world. And this book then, her examination of the practice of organized religion was very helpful to me in terms of setting out some of the material here. So what are the ethical problems that might appear in evangelism? Deceit, disguise, and diversion. In one case, in Batten's book, she refers to a group, and I'm sorry I didn't make the specific, I didn't get the specific name of the group. And Lauren, you may remember this
Yeah,
yourself.
it's Moses David, the children of God.
Yeah.
I
And they
once
literally used women, luring them, men with promise of sex somehow.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. They called it flirty fishing.
Ah, there you go. And mind you, there are different explicit levels of doing this. One can have a ministry, for instance, on campuses where testosterone flows pretty highly, right? Um, yeah, well, we could go off. Suffice to say that some people have obviously passed over the line of appropriate ethics when they use deceit, disguise, and diversion, falsely portraying others' views. And when I say other, I'm talking here about the theologians, the churches that we pit ourselves against in order to discuss our convictions about this or that element of belief. And I think back to the days when Adventist pastor evangelists, itinerant, right, would go to villages, and I mean villages, they weren't really cities yet in those days, and ask the local people, who's the most popular preacher in the town or in the village, and then they would challenge that preacher to a debate. So behind some of the materials you'll see still in slides in evangelism decks, and Lauren, maybe this is worth mentioning as well, that, and some people I'm sure don't know this, but there are informational programs, slides, decks that pastors use that have been around for generations, that have material. And again, I hope you'll forgive my little discursus, but falsely portraying others' views. So I was teaching for Calamasa a couple of years ago, and the quarterly quoted a source within Catholic doctrine, within Catholic tradition. I've forgotten it, but I searched it out. I couldn't find it anywhere. Not even artificial intelligence could find it. And so I asked my Catholic colleague. He's actually my boss, and he's not a priest. But he's a theologian, a moral theologian. And I asked him about this source, and we have lovely conversations. It's a very wonderful relationship. And he said, Mark, I'm sorry, but I'll have to spend a minute trying to find that one. I've never heard of it. And so he came back some hours later and said, oh, yeah, so here it is. And frankly, it's irrelevant. And I thought, how in the world can we appropriately, from the General Conference, use sources like this to portray the views of others? And I took that as inappropriate. Well, moving on, promises. When we make promises that might be either unverifiable or outright false, and I've given two illustrations here, and I'm certain that some on the call will be upset. And I understand that. These are not things that I come to easily. My wife's own family came to Adventism because her father had health problems, and it was good for him to become an Adventist, arguably, obviously, but not for everybody. And to just give a blanket promise for better health. And as we were talking earlier, Lauren, a blanket promise for greater financial security if you just tithe. These things, they shouldn't just be thrown out there without some kind of nuance. Manipulating, coercing with inducements, money, Bibles, gifts for attendance. These are relatively mild things, right? On the other hand, I was taken aback one time when I first heard about meetings, I think it was in British Columbia, where they were offering money to people to attend the sessions. And the financial people had done their work and argued that we can invest in all kinds of advertising, all kinds of gifts giving away, bring in evangelists, all this stuff. And at that time, it was about $3,000 per convert. I don't know what it might equate to now, and I'm sure it's different around the world. But someone came up with the idea, okay, well, let's just invite people and tell them we're going to give them $3,000 if they come to every meeting. It makes perfect sense if you're working from a consequence-based perspective, right? If the consequences of investing $3,000 per person equate to one person, what does it matter how we engage that equation? I think the other one here, corrupting relations within a family, is diabolical. And I've heard evangelists say, don't you dare go back to your family and let them tie your emotions and keep you from the truth. You cannot let them in their emotional efforts to keep you in their dysfunctional, unbelieving families to keep you from accepting this truth. And I think, again, this next one, targeting children through babysitting and other VBS children's programmings of some sort. And I'm not impugning all VBS programs, not in the least bit. But when an evangelist manipulates the material for the babysitters at a meeting in order to plant seeds, to make some sort of alliance with children so as to influence and convict the parents, that strikes me as particularly ugly. And then hidden benefits to the host or hosts, especially the evangelist or pastor. We've all heard of conferences providing funds for pastors who will do meetings, who will host an evangelist. So whether those funds are personally distributed or to a congregational need, that sort of thing is difficult to justify, in my view. So, what are the counter arguments? Well, we might argue that paternalism is one of the things that would justify what we're up to. We know what is best for the person. We know what's best for you, we would say to them if they were to challenge us. Again, justification. We know what is best for you because we know that God is your creator and sustainer. And you'll thank us for this someday. Or we're only helping you make good decisions for yourself. Benevolent deception is one of my favorite things, in part because it has been so long used in medicine. As long as we don't personally or corporately, that is, as a whole body of the church, benefit from the deception, known in medicine as therapeutic privilege. And you can imagine, I think the easiest way to understand this quickly is imagining a retired couple ready to go on their first cruise after having retired, and the doctor having to sit down with them before and share a diagnosis of terminal cancer or of a terrible cancer for one of them. Does the physician wait until after the cruise to tell them that, or does the physician tell them that before the cruise? Now, mind you, benevolent deception or therapeutic privilege, there is this knowledge that the physician has. Is the physician obliged to transfer that knowledge immediately, and in what way? Or can the physician use their practical wisdom to know when to share that knowledge? And there's a long and I think worthy debate about that. So I understand that there would be those within pastoral evangelism to push back and say, look, Mark, we do know that God is our creator and sustainer. So we really are engaging in a conversation with a convert in their best interest. It's a tough one, but I don't think it can justify most of the actions that cause us pause. All right. So 5 thoughts for pastor evangelists. I have 3 more slides, 5 thoughts here, 5 thoughts on the next slide, and then some no-nos for pastor evangelists. And then we'll be able to have a conversation. I'm not sure if we're going to make it to our regular time slots, but I think this topic deserves lots of conversation. So, all right. So number 1, always have a conversation partner. I'm speaking to the pastor, if you will, the evangelist, if you will. Always have a conversation partner. This is a good rule for anybody, but always have a conversation partner that you trust enough to talk to, with full transparency. That to me, for pastors, is just non-negotiable. It has to be that case. Whether it's another pastor or not, it doesn't matter. But you have to have someone that you can talk to. Never allow the conference, the church, to dictate your ministerial agenda. They obviously have to influence it, but never allow the church to dictate your agenda. Your religious and spiritual convictions and beliefs have always been, are now, and will continue to be in a process of development. Don't allow yourself to think otherwise. The second coming of Jesus is not essential to your faith, nor is it essential to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I've been known to say plenty of controversial things over my career, over my calling, over my vocational life. This is one of the more challenging of them. I don't believe the second coming of Jesus is essential to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the sooner we figure that out, the better off we'll all be. Altruism and egoism are always in play. Altruism must rule the day. Altruism means having the interest of the other over your own interests. When in conflict, altruism demands that you prioritize the interests of the other. Now, that's not going to help if you take a thoroughgoing paternalistic view of the sort we just talked about, saying, look, this is for your best good. I am being altruistic here. But I think that's it's actually a lack of self-reflection to realize how much ego is involved in this conversation. All right, 5 more things. Ordinary human relationships are sacred, even when deeply troubled, and should never be used to secure a convert. Isolating a prospective convert from family to convince them to join the church is a grievous ethical breach. Blanket, often false promises, tithe giving, dietary change, cannot be baked into the evangelistic material. Insisting upon membership and one worldwide polity creates religious colonialism that ought to be unethical. More and more, I've thought membership is a real block. Now, it depends how membership is engaged. Some pastors can and do ignore it. It's hard to ignore, in my view. And I think if we continue to insist upon it from the highest levels, and to include a one worldwide polity, for instance, on women's ordination, it's just hard to justify, ethically speaking. I want to embrace, maybe you haven't heard the term maternalism in clinical ethics. It's important. It's not widely used yet. Paternalism has been rejected, thankfully. And again, paternalism is simply assuming that the man, the father, knows best what's for you. Well, there is some literature now emerging in clinical ethics that seeks maternalism. And the most important distinction here in terms of comparing and contrasting the two is that the essence of maternalism, and some of these may be stereotypically defined, but suffice to say there are some general patterns that society does reflect. Maternalism tends to be more relational. And as I noted earlier, I lean toward a relational ethics. And paternalism is portrayed more in line with a sort of divine command, a duty-based ethic. And in terms of helping people make decisions together in clinical ethics, I think is a good way to imagine helping people make decisions in an evangelistic or pastoral setting. To have a deep, thoroughgoing conversation about how you're living life well and how to do it in light of what's going on in your life. And maternalism wants to say, we can do this together in a relational context that will help the whole as we decide to live together. Testimonies should be avoided at all costs. You heard me right. You read that correctly. Testimonies should be avoided at all costs. If they're allowed, then a counter testimony must be included. I wish I had a dime for every time I've heard a positive, lovely testimony. I'm not suggesting testimonies aren't beautiful, beautiful things. They are. But there are people listening to the testimony that are just shattered inside, going through horrific, painful, ugly things. And they sit in silence and suffer through the gushing joy of the testimonies at play up front. All right. Finally, a list of pastoral evangelist no-nos. Lying is occasionally justifiable. You heard that correct as well. An ethicist just said that lying is occasionally justifiable, but never to benefit yourself, the other, or the church. Deceiving others in order to get them connected to God is always unethical. Never believe that your motivations are in harmony with God's desires. That would be self deception, self deception. Never believe that your motivations are in harmony with God. I understand the peace that that brings, right? And we have to wrestle with it, and we pray, and we engage our relationship with God. But I can never trust that my motivations are not skewed in some way, shape, or form. Maybe this is just the effect of that sense of sin on humankind that is so deep as part of our tradition that I would want to say this, but I think it's worth saying. Number three, don't allow the belief of the second coming to dominate your ministry. Yeah, we can say more. Altruism and egoism is always at play in your head. Thoroughgoing altruism is humanly impossible, so never allow yourself to think that you aren't driven by some measure of self. Even mild distortion of what the other says, believes, or argues is always unethical. Even when you have good intention for the listener, good results, going back to consequence-based theories, good results don't justify distortion and or deception. 6, materialistic presence should never be a persuasive tool, even, and I would say especially subconsciously. For instance, when an evangelistic team from the United States goes to a culture, a society that has very little, if any, technological or some of the main routine comforts of American life, our lovely dress, the technology we use, the giveaways that we bring with us, the entourage of all these people that come for one person to stand up front and give a message. These cannot become an enticement. They are an enticement. It's impossible not to be enticing and attractive when you bring all of this fancy stuff from the United States. And maybe I'm talking in this case to a tradition of evangelism that doesn't exist all that much these days. And I'm unsure about that presently. Happy to be challenged by those who have been more involved in evangelism these days. I haven't been for some time. But I do think, at least historically, it's been a difficult thing to balance. Finally, stop speaking the truth in love. I used to hear this so frequently from my church members, and some of them who encouraged me to speak the truth in love from the pulpit. It's not the first time you've heard me say this, if you've had any exposure to what I've written or spoken about. I just, while it's an ideal to speak out of a true voice of love, no one can do that. No human can do that. If there was a human that ever did it, it would be Jesus, and you are not Jesus. So don't think, again, going back to number 2, never believe that your motivations are in harmony. Don't think that you can speak the truth in love. You can't. You just can't. So just take that off of your screen. All right, there you go. Let's talk. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I see plenty of action in the chat thread, Lauren. Oh dear, we've got some heavyweights lined up for the question and conversation time.
Thank you so much, Mark. I've been writing as fast as I can on my manila pad here to kind of summarize and take notes because I feel like I missed out on ethical stuff in my seminary as well as undergrad as a pastor, but just tremendous stuff. And I know we have several people lined up here, and we encourage more people. Down at the bottom of your screen, if you click the React button, you can raise your hand there and get in the queue for our conversation. And a lot of amazing and important things to ponder. I wish more pastors could hear what you said this morning. That's
well,
amazing.
I've been invited occasionally to speak to pastors. Never invited a second time.
Well, let's start with Ed Reifsnyder. Thank you for contributing here this morning.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Hi, Ed.
Thank you, Mark. Much needed perspective, in my opinion. Uh, During my career, I became aware of an absence of an ethical focus within Adventism, period.
Uh-huh.
Um, First time I really came to my mind was during the Davenport scandal,
Oh, sure.
which increasingly fewer people know about.
Mhm. Sadly.
But the thing that was so bad about that was the number of church leaders who engaged in unethical behavior.
Hmm.
And I came to the conclusion in talking with some of them that they didn't know they were being unethical.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
was an ignorance.
Yep.
And right now, I mean, it's on our Adventist Today Facebook page right now. There's a financial scandal going on in Kenya
Uh,
where church leaders advise people to invest in a Bitcoin scam.
oh, dear.
Everybody lost lots of money. And who knows what the ethical knowledge or consideration was among the
Yeah.
participants of that.
Yeah. Let me
Um,
pause here just a moment, Ed. For someone, if you would, look up a link for the Davenport scandal and prop it in the chat thread, if you would, so that others would know what Ed's talking about. That'd be great.
um, I myself became much more aware of ethical concerns when I left Adventist healthcare. I'd spent the first half of my career in
Right.
Adventist healthcare and started doing consulting work. And my first client was a Catholic health system.
Ah. Sure.
I started frequently encountering, particularly from the nuns, the word ethics.
How about that?
It was much more, ethics were much more of a focus in the Catholic world than in the world that I had come from. And I'm not trying to dismiss Adventist
Sure.
healthcare. I'm
Yeah.
very much engaged in Adventist healthcare indirectly. Uh, but it was surprising to me how big an issue that was when it came to employees, when it came to patients, when
Mhm.
it came to their own ethics as a Catholic system.
Yeah.
It was a frequent topic of conversation.
Yeah.
Um, and kind of turning a corner, some people want to link ethics with the Bible. That appeared in the chat.
Mhm.
And some would say it's a basic matter of morality. Well, I think there's a subtle difference between ethics and some of those matters because in today's world, particularly in healthcare, but in lots of other spaces like the ones you've pointed out today, ethics, the Bible may not answer these questions. They're not even addressed in the Bible.
Exactly.
And I think that this is just personal opinion. I believe that an ethics class should be required of every major in an Adventist college,
Hmm.
whether it's business, whether they're in pre-law, whether they're going into education, no matter what their field, even if they're going to be a scientific researcher, ethics are a big deal there. Uh, so probably we need to be changing our culture as a group of people, but by focusing more on this topic.
Hmm. Well, thanks, Ed.
Sorry I wandered so long.
No, that's fine. It's worthwhile reflecting on the different contexts, and just for some perspective to give you a sense of, again, within the healthcare world that I live in, At Providence St. Joseph Health, there is a team of about 12 full-time ethicists, funded, of course, by the corporation. The Joint Commission, the accrediting body for most hospitals in the United States, the Joint Commission doesn't have any requirements whatsoever, other than to say a facility has to have a way to deal with ethical issues, period. Well, this healthcare corporation that I work with employs 13 people, focused solely on theology and ethics, right? It's roughly the same size of Advent Health. Advent Health recently hired their first full-time ethicist, a person I know, I've worked with and known for decades. First one. And has empowered him to create a department for Advent Health. And wow, let's applaud them, please. Long and deep, let's support them as they make this effort. It's going to change things for the better. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I was just off reading a little bit about Davenport, refreshing my memory on that situation. George, let's ask you to unmute. I think I clicked. There we go. Join the conversation, please.
Okay, Mark, thanks again for your valuable presentation, as usually.
Thank you, George.
Yeah, good to see you there. And I see that there are more people on my island now. The moderator is in this island too.
You can't see the back of your head because the camera is reversed the other direction.
Yeah, and this is not the Epstein island. Okay, please. Mark, the problem of ethics is really big in the church. It starts, if you know, the preamble to the 28 fundamentals. The very first sentence, it says clearly, bluntly, that the Bible is the Adventists' only creed.
Right.
Okay. This is ethical violation number one right there, because this is a lie.
Yeah.
It is not. Long-term Adventists or people who know Adventists well, no, this is a horrible lie, and nobody's ashamed about it. Nobody's thinking about correcting this.
Yeah,
so,
I often refer to it as a rhetorical flourish.
Yeah, and so this is the thing. I understand that another area is the pastors and teachers' dilemma. When you know that something is not right or is actually wrong, and you have to teach that. You see? Yeah. Doctrinally, a problem. I remember in 1994, in the middle of the school year, I was hired to teach Bible for the La Sierra Academy.
Mm-hmm.
And there were many people, many other candidates for that, and they came to me and said, well, yeah, we want you. And I was very, very clear. I disclosed right there. I am a Fordite. I do not accept all this thing about the sanctuary and all that, 1844. I am with Ford. And they just said, oh, shut up, we don't talk about this. You don't have to talk about this, and that's it. Well, because not many people do it. I haven't seen other people disclosing that they don't believe certain things, but they are still in a position, as if they are supporting. And more lately, another ethical problem that I see is many church members, a lot of church members supporting MAGA. When the MAGA movement is, what it is. It's killing people, it's persecuting people, it's starting illegal wars, it's lawlessness, institutionalized and all that. So thank you for bringing up this issue, because it's time for people to start thinking a little bit more conscientiously, a little bit more ethically
Yeah.
and
Well,
honestly.
yeah,
So thank you again.
Thank you, George. Appreciate it. A couple things come to mind, and by the way, Chris has already left your island apparently. Um, I first on that notion of sources of authority, right, and what I refer to as rhetorical flourish from those who would invoke sola scriptura and only sola scriptura. One of the things that I'd like to continue to be involved in within the church, and one of the reasons that I pursued and maintain license credentials is I want to be involved in the conversation. And I like to put it now as I'm on the inside of the outer edge of the Adventist community, if you will. So one of the things that I take joy in is that I will present a paper fairly soon in April with the Friedensau group in Germany. They have a conference every 2 or 3 years, bringing scholars together across the world on various topics, and they've accepted a paper that I shared a previous iteration of my paper in a Festschrift for Alden Thompson. And if you've not seen that, I would encourage you. You can find it on Amazon, I'm certain. The Philistines are upon us. That's the name of the book, because that was Alden's phrase at the end of class. The Philistines are upon us. We have to leave now. And there is substantive scholarly conversation, always has been, on the topic of sola scriptura and other sources of authority. But again, it doesn't make its way to the top, I think, primarily because those at the top like the rhetorical effect of saying that we're scripture and scripture only. And I get that. It's just that I can't agree with it. Bjorn, I think you're next, huh?
Bjorn is traveling by foot, I understand, according to his phone. Join us, please.
Hi. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Carr, for fascinating. I would love to be in one of your classes. I thought you made very, very valid points there. Especially growing up as a missionary kid, I recognize a lot of those tactics. So my question, and I apologize already if this forces you into what your clinical students were doing, where they wanted practical tips, basically, and you wanted to stay with the frameworks. But I've said this before in this class. I work with teens a lot. My kid is just almost a tween as well, and so I need concrete stuff.
Bless you, my child.
it needs to be concrete. So when I listen to a presentation like yours, I'm like, he's making super valid points. At the same time, do we run into the risk when we make these kinds of presentations that focus primarily on the problematic sides of evangelism, truth telling, telling the truth in love? What was the other one? Testimonies. Do we make the mistake of being similarly sort of comparing our best points to their worst and excluding the genuinely good stories and good strategies and just heartwarming stuff that has built faith communities, that has really strengthened kids' spiritual relationships with God, that have they're the reason that we're probably in this room. I mean, do we run the risk of being unethical by presenting these kinds of presentations?
Thanks for that, Bjorn. We do run the risk of being unethical. I wouldn't say otherwise. And the challenge is essential. I think for any one point that might be made in a negative sort, the alternative can be made in a positive sort. And I think that theory, again, is not irrelevant here. And it is obviously a task of a teacher to help people understand theory in a practical way, which is part of the reason that I forced myself toward the end of the slides to pay attention to details within my experience of things that I want to encourage and things that I want to say are no-nos. So there are some measures of practicality there. For instance, you can tell your tween that lying is generally not appropriate. But you'll notice that I did say that lying is occasionally justifiable. So help your tween understand the nuance there. That puts us in space that is tension, full of tension. It arises, it provokes tension. Then continue the conversation in a relationship-oriented perspective, right? Not, okay, God says, don't bear false witness. So never ever lie, son, right? Or else you will be on God's bad side. That's horrible. I'm sorry if I hope you, I hope, Bjorn, I'm not stepping literally on your toes. But in a relational context, truth and deception have nuance that can't be baked into a fundamental belief. Like, how could a pastor get up behind a pulpit and say, occasionally it's okay to lie, and let me tell you some ways that's that doesn't play in Peoria, right? So
Right.
So I do think there's practical stuff here, but I take your point. We could do a better and maybe even have a more lingering positive effect if we told positive stories rather than negative stories. And so appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks for the answer.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's go on to Courtney this morning. We'll ask her to unmute and join the conversation.
Well, actually, Bjorn said a lot of what I was going to say, to be quite honest. So I don't want to belabor or do too much repetition, but I will say that I think that some of these examples are a little bit. You kind of talked about how some of the things that we build up as our practices are steeped in cultural identity. I think that even the way that we form ethics is also based in cultural identity. And so one of the things, there were several things that stood out to me, but one of the ones that was really glaring to me was about the testimonies. And I think that when we're talking about relationships with other human beings and other people, being able to have a testimony where we're talking about how we have made it from one point to another, how we have been able to traverse something that's been difficult. That is very much rooted, I think, in a Christian tradition, yes, but also just speaking from my own cultural lens, that's a very that's a very deeply rooted cultural thing. And so to say, well, it's unethical to have a testimony if you don't have a counter testimony because somebody out there might be hurting. I think that that's a very particular lens, and I'm sure that there are some people who might feel that way, but I think that it also sort of ignores how some communities and some cultures relate to one another. And even though for some people, it might seem like some of these approaches might be manipulative or in other ways like unethical or feeling like they're building on something else, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a blanket unethical thing to be done. And so I just want to just sort of put that out there that, we really have to have a nuance of how people live life together in different communities and in different contexts. And I think that someone even in the chat was talking about, like in certain Asian cultures, about, how they talk about or withhold information and, in different illnesses and things like that. And so there's lots of nuances that I think that depending on the lens and the community that you are from, might not be universally applicable.
Yeah, Courtney, thank you very much. I do agree completely with you. I really do. And part of what I've put on the slides is reflecting my own experience where the testimony that I'm referring to is baked into the work of the pastor and of the evangelist for the express purpose of manipulating or convincing the audience, the listener, to come along with him and to make similar decisions. Now, that's a very different and calculated reality from what I think you're describing. And I wouldn't disagree with you at all. They're different subcultures and societies do it differently. It's part of family, when family gets together, and then when communities of faith get together who know each other well and know the testimony. And mind you, the type of testimony I'm talking about, where like that evangelist pastor during my ninth quarter, who, you know, essentially guided this woman to selling off her jewelry and putting her up front to tell that story, was explicitly designed to get people to get rid of their jewelry and to make the decision to join the church. There was no nuance to that. And I think what you may be portraying is the kind of testimony where people in the conversation know each other well enough to say, I know, sister, that this must be hard. Or in other words, there's a way to share God's blessings in a relational context. Again, the ethic of a relational context, the care ethic, maternalism, is that the people in the conversation know each other well enough to know when they might be causing difficulty for their loved one in that conversation. And I think that's a different contextual reality. So thanks for drawing attention to it.
Bill Cork, let's have you join our conversation
Hey,
today,
Bill.
Brother Bill.
Hey, Mark, good to see you.
Likewise.
And as you might guess, my reflections come from a world of chaplaincy. I'd noted in the comments that I'd had an ethics course at AUC back in the dark ages from Audley Stafford, who was amazing. And then I went to La Sierra, Loma Linda. It was still Loma Linda at that time. I was studying with Paul Landa, who told us about his experience as a young kid going to the Vatican museums with his father and learning that there are no tiaras with vicarious filii Dei on them. So Paul was the first one who really exposed me to the deception and the lack of interest in what is true, even though these things were pointed out by Prescott and others 100 and some odd years ago. But then it was when I did my first unit of CPE back in 1986, 40 years ago, that I first really was exposed to ethics in regard to ministry.
And CPE is, for the audience?
Clinical pastoral education. Yes. And ever since then, you know, I've seen just the congregational ministry / evangelists of the Adventist Church and chaplains really going in very different directions on this. And one issue is clergy confidentiality.
I didn't.
And here's an example of how that. I had a young person come to me and tell how she had confided to her pastor some secret that her pastor then went and told her mom, even though this is a woman in her 20s. And then my surprise some months later when that pastor came to me and wanted to be endorsed as a chaplain. And of course, I can't say, no, I can't let you do this because of this.
Right.
So my response was just going to drag this out, not respond to a lot of emails, and wait till he found some other interest. But that's the kind of thing where my dad was a car salesman. And I saw him wrestle ethically with what he experienced in an environment where the bottom line and the numbers are all that it's about. And you will do anything to get those numbers. And I saw the same attitude, especially in some conferences. And it didn't matter what you said. It didn't matter if your historical quotes were all from Uriah Smith. And I tried talking about these things with some ministerial directors from a position of somebody in the division office of chaplaincy, but no, nobody even wanted to have the conversation. And you don't see articles in ministry about these things. So how do we get that conversation? How can we encourage the ministerial, now that the ministerial association has been led by a couple of chaplains now? So that's my question.
Well, I appreciate that. A couple things come to mind. One, Angela Lee and the person at the head of the department recently were engaged in conversation with me about developing a track in bioethics for the learning programs. And I apologize for not knowing exactly what the titles are for each, but we talked together about basic resources and what chaplains need to be exposed to if they want to go down a bioethics track. So I think there is incremental progress, Bill. And to go back to your point about having had an ethics course, I want to be clear for people on the call today. When I say that Seventh-day Adventist institutions do not have a program in ethics, I'm not saying that they don't have interest or courses in ethics. What I'm saying is that there are no degree programs in ethics, right? And generally, the coursework that is maybe required is not taught by an ethics expert. It's almost always taught by the New Testament person who has an interest in ethics. And God bless all people who have interests in ethics, right? But that's not the same thing as a thoroughgoing degree program with multiple professors who have ethics PhDs or whatever terminal degree in that particular field. And I think I don't know that we can be optimistic that that will happen within the church anytime soon, but I'm going to keep talking about it until I die. So we'll see what we can do. Thanks, Bill.
Lauren, please share with us.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. We need to get Bill back to teach for us again. He really taught us a class next week.
Oh, Charles Teal, he just put in the chat thread for sure. He's memorable. My word.
Just to let you know, next week we will be having, I think it's a great privilege. We're having Ben Clausen from Geoscience, and he's going to be talking it. And this is kind of unusual because this was Adventist today, and Ben works for the very conservative Geoscience Research Institute. And he's coming, he's going to speak on making friends with science. And I'm looking forward to that. When I was in my ninth quarter, Mark, I remember one of the, evangelistic training, for those of you who don't know. One of the teachers got up front and said, now, if you're faced with this situation, I don't remember what it was, Mark, but if you're faced with this question, you quote this particular text. And one of the smart students who just got done with 8 quarters at the seminary raised his hand and said, but we've been told that doesn't really mean that. He said, well, yeah, that's true, but it just works so well.
There you go.
Number 2, my first church. Got out of seminary, sent to a little church, and I went around to visit. There was one rather simple, naive little lady who came to church by herself, and I stopped by over at their house to see them. She wasn't home, but her husband was. Very, very kind, very gentle person. And he said, your church has really done a great deal of damage to my family.
Yeah.
And I said, in what way? he said, well, I married a very nice Methodist woman, and for years we went to the Methodist church together and really enjoyed our spiritual life. Now she tells me she's a member of your church, and she tells me that I'm not going to be saved.
Right.
And we can't go to church together because I can't accept what your church teaches. And it's introduced great conflict into our home. Heartbreaking, really.
Yeah.
I was a young pastor. I didn't know quite what to say. I'm sure I didn't say the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
But what I really want to mention to you is something a little different than that. And I think George sort of alluded to this, but for those of us who are pastors, when I started out in the path to ministry, I pretty much thought everything that they told me was true.
Mm-hmm.
And little by little, as I went along, thanks at least in part to some of my teachers, certain things that I abandoned. Early on, I think I realized that the whole 1844 investigative judgment thing probably was at least unnecessary. Didn't need it. But I thought, that's okay. How often do I have to talk about it? But as my ministry went on, more and more things began to fall into that category, Mark.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Things that I just didn't really believe anymore. Now, that never stopped me ever from being a conscientious carer of people. I
Mm-hmm.
really loved people. I wanted them to be happy. I wanted to pray for them. I wanted their lives to be full and rich. But the more time went on, when I got down to like 10 years from the end of my ministry, there was just a lot of things. And I don't want to fall into the what I think you were implying that, well, if you feel guilty about it, it must have been unethical. I'm not sure that's necessarily true,
Mm-hmm.
but it did come to the point where I was feeling pretty much like the range of the things that I could address had come down to some pretty narrow set of things from the Gospels and from the epistles.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the texts that I used to use, going back to the experience in the ninth quarter, I didn't feel comfortable using anymore. I don't think Ecclesiastes 9 actually means that the dead know not anything. I mean, it's still a good idea, but I
Right.
didn't feel comfortable throwing that text out anymore. There are a lot of things like that. And yet I continued to preach in the safe zone that I could. And honestly, to the very, by that point, I was 10 years from the end. I wasn't going to retrain completely to do
Sure.
something
Sure.
else.
Right.
But honestly, I felt pretty guilty about it. And I felt like at times that I was unethical. I don't believe those things anymore. And I evade your questions when you asked me about them.
Right.
And I don't preach on those things. I actually had people come to me and say, Pastor, why don't you preach on how the Catholics are going to persecute us? Why don't you preach on the 1844 message and those things? And I just couldn't do it, Mark. And I found myself at that point feeling like I was unethical.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Say something.
Well, two things come to mind. One, I know pastors who 10, 15, 20 years into their pastoral career feel utterly trapped.
Yeah.
Utterly trapped. They don't have the time, the financial resources to retrain, to do something else. And oftentimes that turns into anger. And they will unconsciously, I think, perhaps consciously, but unconsciously engage in activities, whether preaching or lifestyle or behavioral issues that get them fired. And that's just a sad reality, right? One of the things that I was passionate about after I left pastoral ministry was to try to create an institute, a nonprofit, foundationally funded institute that helps Seventh-day Adventist pastors transition from pastoral life to another career path, because there is no support. And I don't know how many people on the call really recognize this reality. There are ministers in our tradition that are absolutely trapped because, again,
Yes.
something I did say in the slides, your faith is ever and always in an evolutionary reality. You cannot be static in any form of healthy Christian life. Static doesn't work. So why would we think that it would be working for Seventh-day Adventist ministers, right? I never was able to make that dream come true. I still think it would be a profoundly wonderful thing. There was a kid, I'll call him a kid, who showed up in my class at Loma Linda one time after working for 10 years in the Michigan Conference, during a time when the person there whose name should never be repeated. Some of you know who I'm talking about. The man didn't even shake the hand of this minister after 10 years of ministry for him in the Michigan Conference. Didn't even shake his hand or say goodbye. And he shows up in my class trying to reboot himself and his life in a different direction. There are way too many stories like this. And our typical response is, well, I guess they shouldn't have gone into ministry in the first place. They really weren't called. And if some of the audience doesn't realize this goes on, they just haven't been exposed. Those of us who've been inside, we're shaking our heads. We all know people who've been through this, and the church does not serve them well at all. I've forgotten now what the other thing I was going to say, but thank you, Lauren, because it's a very real thing for Seventh-day Adventist ministers.
That's right. And I've known a number of them too. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Lauren, I sit here nodding my head to what you have said and what Mark has said, and I've been raising and lowering my hand here accidentally, intentionally raising, accidentally lowering. But I'm one of those pastors who felt trapped back in 2012. I've told my story briefly here. I don't need to go into it again. Let's bring Ray and Bobby Stovall into the conversation. I've asked them to.
And Chris, remind me to say something about situational ethics, if you will. I saw it in the chat thread, and I want to say something about it briefly.
I will. I'll write it down, and we will remind you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Ray, Bobby.
Hello. This is a question, or more likely asking your viewpoint. What do you see as the reason or reasons why there is a lack of interest or knowledge of ethics within, well, I only know our organization, within the Adventist church from top down? Is there an assumption that because you believe in God, you're an ethical person, or they simply don't know what ethics means?
Well,
you've outlined a lot of different areas where ethics are involved, but we don't see any changes at all.
Yeah.
So what do you think is our issue?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I do have a couple of things that come to mind. One is that if we do spend time talking about ethics approaches, in every class that I taught, I would see light bulbs come on in the minds of my students. The most dramatic one, I didn't list it on my list, but there's a form of ethics called narrative ethics, where it is the story that provides the grounding for persons. And many people see scripture as primarily narrative, as opposed to propositional truth, right? You read scripture, you hear the proposition, you follow that proposition. And one time after a class, a young woman came and said, "Thank you for introducing me to narrative ethics. When I was a kid, I would ask my dad a question, an ethics question, and I was so hopeful for a good answer, but he never gave me a good answer. I was always so mad at him." And I said, "Well, why? What did your father do?" She said, he would sit down and tell a story. And I didn't know what on earth he was telling me this story for. But now, she said, I understand he was a Native American, and stories are the way they frame their life. So I do think if we can just have a moment to kind of overlook this turf, but here's the direct answer to your question, Ray. And I'm assuming Ray and Bobby, I love you guys, you're always on the same screen. If you give yourself to Christ, what possible questions could remain? That's what professors tell students all the time. There was actually one person, and others on the call may remember this person. He was the head of the Biblical Research Institute, and he had a flat top haircut, gray head, flat top haircut. I've repressed his name. Does anyone remember? He was in charge of the committee for the view of what was the name of that committee now? I'm getting so old, I don't remember all of this stuff. At the BRI, there was a subcommittee on the Christian view of human life. And he was the head of that committee. And back in the days when Jerry Winslow was on that committee, trying to help navigate some of the difficult issues. And this group put out statements about this or that ethical issue. Female genital mutilation was one of them. Capital punishment was one of them. Abortion was one of them, right? And he sat on the head of this committee, and someone at one point heard him say, it's well documented, there is no such thing as ethics. There is no discipline of ethics. This is an Adventist highest scholar the church has at the head of BRI, according to GC Understanding, right? Who said literally there is no such thing. So Ray, we shouldn't be surprised that that kind of attitude still pervades. When we give ourselves to God, he will make everything clear to us. Just pray and read scripture. You will find your way. And God bless when that works, right? I don't mean to demean that. We can tell positive stories. I agree. And a more positive story would be to tell more about, for instance, that woman who came to me after class and discovered the beauty of a story to helping her understand how to live life. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you so much. Let's go on to Doug Myers from Oregon. We got you unmuting here, and thank you.
Mark, you mentioned a name that took me back,
Oh,
and my
dear.
wife too. Teresa's on the call, and Stephen McPherson. I didn't know your
Yes.
story enough at the time. I just knew you were a pastor, and I remember Steve McPherson. We I hope this isn't too rough, but we would call him Adolph McPherson and his Sabbath afternoon death marches.
Sure.
It was he was a good pastor, a good conference leader, but
Yeah.
anyway, that
Oh, he
was
was very good to me. He would always answer a question with another question when I engaged him, and that did really set me off on a course of exploration. Yeah.
he was a thoughtful guy. What I wanted to comment on was it strikes me as odd, terribly odd, that during my mostly aviation career, but after that, I dabbled a little bit in other transportation and became a driving instructor here in Oregon. And there's a code of ethics
Yeah.
for driving instructors. Uh, it's like, okay, what happened to lots of other people along the way?
Yeah.
No code of ethics for anyway. And that also made me think of something that happened a number of years back. For a totally different reason, I was looking at Unitarian Universalists in a particular context. And I noticed that they didn't really have 28 fundamental beliefs. In fact, they didn't have any at all.
Yeah.
But what they did have I thought was remarkable. They had covenants, which was explicitly for the purpose of defining how they relate to each other.
Mhm.
And there was some marvelous examples. Now, they don't have a universal one, in spite of the fact they're universalists, but they have each in their, I don't know, diocese or whatever they call them. And I thought that was remarkable, and I still believe that Adventists would be a long ways down the road if they quit emphasizing 28 fundamental beliefs that hold us together and, in fact, described covenants. Why can't we, even if we got to hang on to these 28, whether we want to or not, why can't we have some kind of descriptive covenant that describes how we will relate to each other in a way that I like to use the term that I've borrowed from Herb Montgomery, life-giving versus death dealing.
Yeah.
Um, it's basically the golden rule. I would like for others to relate to me in a life-giving way, and I believe it's in our collective best interest that I relate to others in a life-giving way, which is, I believe, at the heart of what you've been talking about.
Mhm.
Uh, Albeit now it's possible for me, given my social location, white, straight, cisgender, male, old fart, to think of what's life-giving to me instead of what's life-giving to, as you related to it, those on just on the inside of the outside perimeter
Yeah.
who have a very different social location in many ways. But I think if we're perceptive and careful and ask those kind of questions, to me, I think that that can be incredibly helpful in trying to recast what has become a very doctrinally focused denomination that has to define who's inside the box.
Yeah.
Anyway, just some thoughts.
Yeah, it does. It does go back to what I was trying to assert about having a relational
Yes,
ethic at the head of our thoughts and minds. I don't know how much you've read from Chuck Scriven, but Chuck has a book that goes over the history of the development of our fundamental beliefs and highlights the earliest expression of what we believe. And it was far more in line with what you're suggesting.
yes,
A kind of covenantal approach to be together as a community. I think the other thing that's relevant to it, to what you've commented in terms about how to extend or expand our sense of who's in, who's out, who's okay, who's not, that sort of thing. Adventism grew up in the context, as I noted earlier, of those itinerant preachers who identified who we are as who we're not.
yes,
That is, find the preacher in town who's the most formidable, the most popular, and show him where he's wrong and we're right. And the assumption being the audience will then be with us because we've shown them how wrong they are and how right we are. One of the things I tried to do for decades in some of my educational material is to highlight our commonalities as opposed to our differences. I know that that's not typical in Western Christianity, but that I don't care. I think it's more biblical, frankly, and I'll say it here as well, and maybe prompt some further conversation. The great controversy for Seventh-day Adventism is a profoundly important narrative. I don't think it's all that helpful when it comes to seeing God in the other, because it does incline us toward a conflict and seeing the devil in the other as opposed to God. So, how can we read Ellen White's great controversy with a positive view of what we have in common with others in the grand narrative of life that God has created for us here. That's an extraordinary challenge for Adventism. But going back to what I said on my slides, we don't need the second coming to be devoted to God and to have a community of faith. We just don't. We don't. Even if it's baked into our name, we don't. We have plenty of resourceful material that we can highlight in very positive ways to wrap our arms around persons in a universal sort of context. Yeah. Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it.
I want to jump in here and have Clarence join us. So we'll get back to George. We have a little more than 20 minutes, a little less than 20 minutes left. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Doctor, for this very beautiful presentation. Very instructive, in fact, very much so. Now, personally, I do have a little problem, not with the presentation, but with the topic, or let's say the inner workings of the topic. Let me put it this way. What do you do when you are aware that what you will advance will be destabilizing to a church member, may well drive that one out of the church and out of any relationship with God? You may just decide, well, I don't want to hear anything about religion anymore. What does one do?
Yeah,
For example,
well,
let me give you a simple example. Any knowing person today would realize that a creation in 7 days just doesn't hold anymore. We know too much today to advance a creation in just 7 days. And besides, we have two creation stories in Genesis 1 to 2 verse 3, and Genesis chapter 2 verse 4, another story. Obviously, there are dynamics going on there. Obviously, there is a discussion going on in a particular community, whether Babylonian or Sumerian or whatever, but there is a discussion going on, and people are wondering, and these have come down right down to our Hebrew writers, and they present us with two stories of creation. What do you do then if you are aware that somebody is really attached to one and presenting another, or even suggesting something else, will throw that person out? What is the ethical position to take? Personally, I have a problem with it.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Two stories come to mind, and they're both relational. One, when I was a senior at Walla Walla College, John Dibdall had been my counselor through those years. And we were in a public setting talking with, I think it was a gathering of the theology club for the department there. And I asked the question about how it would be for me when I'm in my congregation as a pastor, when I want to preach on something that I have come to understand in ways different than the traditional church teaching. And I asked, how do I do that? How do I share this with them? And let me slide in here. One of the things I put on my slide, don't allow yourself to think you can speak the truth in love. I don't know if you were on the call, Clarence, when I got to that point.
Yes, when I came in, you were just putting that one on. Thanks.
I think much of the way to do this is attitudinal, with kindness, because the people who would use the phrase, you must speak the truth in love, frankly, didn't care how it landed in people's ears.
That's the problem.
Right? And so that's why I want to try to keep people from doing that. Have the conversation in relationship with someone. And that's what John told me. He said, you have to be so close to your congregation that they know where your heart is and what you want to share with them. And you do it gently, Mark. And more of a bull in a china shop. And John knew that about me, right? So he was doing it. And if you knew John and if you know his son Paul, these are two of the most gentle people you've ever met in your life. My gosh, they can say stuff that I wouldn't even imagine saying. And they do it with such grace, with such continuing of that relational context. I don't know that Adventism has learned how to do that well, Clarence. And that's part of what I want to try to emphasize is finding the points of commonality, stay in relationship, speak with a passion and a compassion in your voice rather than with a challenge and debate sort of orientation. And my hope is that that will keep people in the conversation, even if we come to differing points of conviction, perhaps. Now, I don't know if that's helpful, Clarence, but it's as good as I can get.
I want to bring Ron in here. You've been patient here, and then we want to get back to you, Mark, about situational ethics in our last 13 minutes. Go ahead.
Oh, well, thanks so much for the discussion, and it's a discussion that needs to continue for here through eternity. Just retired as a pastor, and it hit me over the last decades of my career. I mean, all the examples that you gave are just so relevant and still fresh in my mind. But it hit me that my life choice to be a pastor. You take a look at what's the number one fear of people in America, and it's public speaking over death. And yet we as pastors, what do we choose to do? We choose to stand in front and speak, and the lights are on us and the microphone is up and everyone is frowning at the kid who happens to cry to interfere with our message. And now even the cameras are on us and we speak with the authority of the Word of God.
Yeah.
It takes a certain amount of arrogance to do that and to stand in that and to take that position. And without a recognition of the arrogance that we as pastors, I'm going to say have to have, but do have in following our work, this conversation is going to have to keep going on and on and on because that arrogance gets in the way of all of the issues that you are bringing up. And so as a fallen, wounded pastor who definitely misstepped many times in that ethical journey. It's a conversation that needs to continue to happen, and yet to encourage those of us who are struggling and frail within that to say, keep going on, and you shoot for the ideal and accept the real, and then there's grace for all of us, and hopefully grace for those that we wound in the presence of trying to deal with our arrogance and how we do what we do. So again, no answers from this point, but just thank you for the discussion, and it needs to continue because we are led by a group of people who've chosen an arrogant career.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. Well said, very well said. I think of, and I don't, I'm not really much of a biblical scholar, but I do think of Paul's passage here, something about preaching is folly. And I thought that so frequently when I would stand in the pulpit. I have stuff I want to say, though, right? There is that compassion. There's passion, that pushes us to get over that sense of really, I'm gonna present a sermon, and we get over it, and then we get practiced at it, and then it becomes an arrogance. Going back to the theories that I presented, I'm unsure whether you were here on the call at that point, but I highlighted virtue ethics, and throughout the talk, I also noted altruism over egoism. So 2 or 3 things come to mind. One, how much do our schools of theology teach ministers about humility, another virtue, right? How much formal material have you been exposed to as a student, as a pastor in ongoing ministerial training? Did you ever get about self-reflection and humility and altruism? And I don't know about you, but I didn't.
We had Helmut Tellica's book, A Little Exercise for Young Theologians, or something on that line that touched on that concept. But it was almost an aside, and I distinctly remember not actually reading the book.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
Because
so
there are more important things at the top of the list. You've got to get X number of growth in your congregation. You've got to get X number of increase in your tithe giving and so on and so forth. These pressing matters, right? And the time for self-reflection, for understanding the arrogance of standing in a pulpit and saying to the group, I was asking Lauren before maybe you got on, when did this tradition of pastors praying before they preach and explicitly using the language of not my words, but your words, God? And how does that set up a congregation for the words that the pastor is now going to share? And I understand, not being a pastor, that it's a little bit arrogant of me, right, to engage and to critique pastors. When I first left congregational ministry, I swore to myself I would be supportive of my pastors going forward. But my golly, sometimes they make it hard.
I don't know. I can answer a question Mark. I'm 65 years old. As a kid, I remember a preacher saying the little prayer, Lord, make me a nail fastened securely in its place.
There you go.
Do you know that prayer?
Yeah. And
hang upon me as little nail a picture of thy face.
There you go. And at seminary, one of my friends, Terry Edwards, would always refer to a concretized theology, thoroughly mixed up and permanently set. Yeah. Anyway, thank you, Ron. I really appreciate it.
We got a couple minutes for situation ethics.
Yes. Twice today, I've heard that, once verbally and once in the chat thread. And I'm unsure where it's coming from. I did have to study it in the 90s for my PhD, but back in the 90s, almost everything I read about it was thoroughly dismissing it. There is no such thing as situational ethics in any formative ethics program that I'm aware of. Now, maybe I'm just unaware of recent material, but situational ethics was a very brief window of time when a guy named Fletcher drew attention to the way that the contextual matters, the contextual features of any given moral problem came to bear on how the principle behind it is being affected by those contextual realities. And it was dubbed at the time situational ethics. Anyone in the field understands it as a debunked field that doesn't have any real standing in the field, because it was nothing more than a blip on the screen that noted, the screen has always noted, the contextual features of any given moral problem are relevant. And now in the subfield of healthcare or biomedical ethics, one of two main methodological camps, one being principles-based or principalism, and the other being casuistry-based or context-based. That group is called the 4-box method of biomedical ethics. Johnson, Sigler, and Winslade are the primary authors of this 4-box method. And they explicitly say in one of those 4 boxes that the contextual features matter. And they go back through history showing how that's the case. Situational ethics is not a thing. And I hope that people can put it out of their mind and just embrace the fact that real contextual features of our reality. Like Clarence pointed out earlier, we know more from science now than we did then. How do we engage the contextual realities of what science is telling us and embrace a Wesleyan quadrilateral approach, if you will, rather than a rhetorical flourish about sola scriptura? Thanks for letting me wedge that in there, Chris.
Thank you so much. In relationship to one of our last comments, I think one thing that teaches preachers humility is to take clinical pastoral education, as
It
Bill
does,
mentioned.
for sure.
It teaches you to examine yourself
It
and to
absolutely
know
does.
how you are perceived by other people.
Yeah.
And it teaches you, you may not be absolutely right on everything.
Yeah.
And it just puts you in a context of a better,
Oh, it's huge.
more humble person as you relate to people religiously.